Yes, it's number one. It's Top of the Pops.
Sugar, oh honey, honey, you are my candy girl, and you got me wanting you, honey, oh sugar, sugar, you are my candy girl, and you got me wanting you. Just can't believe.
And welcome to this week's top DJ, Jimmy Savile.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome indeed to the 300th edition of Top of the Pops. And how about that then? 300 years old today we are, you see, and we have everything to prove it because we have hats here and cakes there and everything. And we also have marvellous music from the Fleetwood Mac.
About the shape I'm in, I can't sing, I ain't pretty, and my legs are thin. But don't ask me what I think of you, I might not give the answer that you want me to. Now when I talked to God, I knew he'd understand. He said, stick by me and I'll be your guiding hand. But don't ask me what I think of you, I might not give the answer that you want me to.
Fleetwood Mac at number 8, a tune called Oh Well. Oh Well, the difficulty now is how to light 300 candles before the end of the show, you see, because they only have one tip a half, and we have to light them like this, you see. Never got all 300 lit. If you don't get all 300 lit, we've had it, because I got to have a lot of puff to blow them out, you see. Top of the Pops being 300 years old today, or 300 sessions old today, and I happen to be on the very first one as well, you see. That's 2 there. That's 296 to go, 295 to go. Meanwhile, here's our tip for the top from Peter Sarstead.
He lived his life as though it was a movie. Humphrey Bogart was his God. He'd become the book that he was reading. He locked his mind in fantasy. He lived his life as though it was a movie. Humphrey Bogart was his God. He'd become the book that he was reading, locked his mind in fantasy. But he never complained when it started to rain. He just waited for the pennies from heaven. He would hold out his hand in a gesture so grand. Everybody wondered what he'd been given. Yes, they did. His life and dream was all he wanted, and his name was Solitaire. Yeah, he never fell to one of the crowded nation, and if he's insane, what am I? Wander down the corridor, wall to wall, jump into the swimming pool and watch your mind swim. Living is a tragedy, though it doesn't mean to be. What do you think your mother is, and what is she for? He lived his life as though it was a movie. Humphrey Bogart was his God. He'd become every book that he was reading, locked his mind in fantasy. Yes, yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, as though it were a movie, that's a record, and that's our tip for the top. I found myself a work, you see, because there's a lot of candles to go through. Incidentally, this is a real cake, actually, ladies and gentlemen. It weighs ages and ages and ages of pounds, and we're going to take it along to a children's hospital immediately afterwards. But just now, we're going to have, from 20 to 17, The Return of Django with the Upsetters and Pan's People. and this one. Carry on. Work hard. Smile at the ladies and gentlemen. Smile at them. There we go. 249 to go. 248 to go. The return of Django there was, ladies and gentlemen, and now only the best music. One and only the Hollies. Thank you.
The road is long, with a many a winding tongue that leads us to who knows where, who knows where. But I'm strong. My brother, so on we go. His welfare is my concern. No burden is he to bear. We'll get there. He ain't heavy, he's my brother. If I'm leaning at all, I'm leaning with sadness that everyone's heart isn't filled with the gladness of love for one another. It's a long, long road from which there is no return. While we're on the way to there, why not share? And the road doesn't weigh me down at all. He ain't heavy, he's my brother. He's my brother. He ain't heavy. He's my brother.
They've all gone out now. They've all gone out now. This should read all the way from Buffalo, ladies and gentlemen. At number 5, the Hollies, and here we have a new release from the. Are you happy you're all married and all that now, Tremolos and all that? Ah, more girls for me. It's the Tremolos, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Windows, and I think of home.
sugar. Oh, honey, honey, you are my candy girl, and you got me wanting you. Honey, oh, sugar, sugar.